I'm around all day, so I decided probably what I'd try and do is put a lot of stuff on here, and bits that capture your attention, come and talk to me afterwards. I'm also wanting to know, what do you do on Cork on a Sunday? Because I'm going to be here for quite a while and I have no idea. Right, so the question is, what could natural flood management do for communities and wildlife? That's what I'm going to try and rattle through in terms of this, just to give you an idea of when we're finally getting to the end of all of this. So it's what is it? Why are people involved in it? What's the interest? What experience can we share with you from Scotland? Some results, and then the importance, if you like, of seeing NFM within a wider context. So the most important thing to say is, what is natural flood management? And there are lots of different names for whatever this is. Nature-based solutions, working with natural processes. Don't get hung up on it. The most important thing is, don't get too tight about that's engineering, that isn't. It's really just about saying this is different to building a flood wall. It's not versus building a flood wall. It's actually just looking at the whole problem of flooding and flood risk reduction in a different way. And that can go almost from landscape architecture type approach through to rewilding. But as I said, don't get hung up about where you sit on that range. You know, if you're sitting in the middle of Darlington, which is where we started a lot of this stuff, the people of Darlington don't want to rewild the place of Darlington. People of Hartlepool would probably quite like to rewild, but that's there's no one from Darlington here, is that? No, fair enough. But that's a really important thing. Don't get hung up on it, otherwise you'll get there. But don't also forget, this isn't just about building things, soft engineering, hard engineering. There's a lot of other stuff. You know, planning. Don't build in a floodplain. I love the comments about Cork to start off with. You know, if the place is called Bogside, which is where I live in Scotland, you know, there's a clue in there. You know, flood-proof buildings. There's warning. There's a lot of other things. So just don't think only about that. So that's the key thing. And the other thing about natural flood management, it's part of a total approach. So it's looking at the whole of a catchment. If, for instance, we were just looking at Cork, about which I know nothing, so apologies if I'm about to say all the wrong things, and you were trying to look about how to stop flooding Cork, you might quite rightly say, we'd like to build some walls. You know about walls. You know where they are, how big they are, what they're made of. They've got concrete. That has problems in terms of climate change, I'm aware. You know who's going to maintain them, who owns them, how big the flood is they're going to solve. And you can build them pretty fast. And none of this should be about saying we don't want walls. It's actually about saying by the time the floods got to that wall, it's actually come quite a long way. It started somewhere. It passed through a whole load of communities and wildlife before it got to Cork. So the question is, shouldn't we be thinking about the processes, the sources, the pathways, being a scientist, before it gets to Cork, as well as defending the people who've invested money, time and everything else in Cork? And that's what it's about. And it's about the different types of land management you can do to try and do that. So it's not NFM or walls and flooding. It's actually, how do we have sustainable long-term flood risk reduction involving all the community? So that's the first thing. So why is there an interest in natural flood management? Well, as I said, it's part of a whole load of other things, and we saw earlier on some of these ideas. Yes, there's some pretty high-profile flooding instances globally. Yes, in the whole of Europe, there's poor ecological status of rivers, and we've got climate change. But then there's lots of other things. There's biodiversity loss, there's woodland expansion, we've got land use planning, ecosystem services. The time has come to think in that way. If you just want to think about flooding, doing nothing is seriously not an option. Globally, you can come up with staggering amounts of money here. So 2000 to 2015, $27 billion a year losses, rising to 60 billion by 2050, and every one of those figures keeps on getting raised, I can assure you. If you look at Europe, 5,000 million. If you look just in Scotland, SEPA, which is the Scottish Environment Protection Agency, estimating 252 million in expected annual flood damages, and that rising as well. These are seriously large amounts of money, seriously large number of people and their livelihoods that are being affected. And traditionally what we've done, actually if you go back a long way, traditionally what we've done is build on the hills. not for nothing is nearly every single church in Scotland and England and probably in Ireland on the top of a hill. You know, there's a parable somewhere about building and sand and yeah, that one. So that's the real traditional idea. Don't try and get in the way of nature, recognise. But we built flood defences and embankments and flood warning schemes and widespread historical land drainage to improve the agriculture, straightening rivers, dredging, all these sorts of things. And in Scotland, this was challenged probably the first time by some really big floods. And instead of occurring in the northwest of Scotland in places where there's lots of sheep and very few people, they occurred in the centre of Glasgow. And there's nothing like concentrating mines if you start flooding your capital cities, or no, Edinburgh's the capital city, so your major urban areas, the biggest city, where there are a lot of people and a lot of money, and people start asking questions, etc. So that was, if you like, the challenge we had. And then we had the poor ecological status. So it was interesting listening to your comments just there about high quality rivers and how far they've declined in Ireland. The same would be true in Scotland. We're very lucky. This is just a very early picture with the red being the heavily damaged rivers. This is also high agriculture and the industrial areas of the centre, and the blue being the better ones. And if you look at what's actually causing that, it's historical changes to the habitat, it's straightening all our rivers, it's barriers to fish, it's nutrient and enrichment, and it's invasive species, just the same as you have here. Poor quality, intensive agriculture. So that's focused the mind. And then you've got climate change. And this is observed changes. This is not predictions. This is the last 60 years in Scotland. You've got much higher winter flows. This is the River Tay, just down from Dundee. You've got much greater variability. These are the floods and the droughts, both of which, of course, affect people and wildlife much more than the averages. You've got drier summers with lower snowmelt, lower spring flows, and really critically, you've got an increase in heavy, intense rainfall events. These things that suddenly appear anywhere. What's the month in Scotland most likely to have a flood? The answer is August. It's not winter. And it's because these occur. Sudden intense rainfall anywhere, hits dry land, woof, down it goes, really locally. So what you've got here is a big change in increased and intense rainfall events, mainly on this west coast. So that's observed. That's not anyone making predictions. If you want to go to predictions, and this is the UK 09 one, they've changed. Again, the dark colour just means lots of changes. Temperature in summer on the left, rainfall on the right, we're seeing big changes. And similarly, if you look at actually predicted changes, this is temperature on the left here for winter, and this is winter rainfall. We're seeing, the darker here is between 15 and 20% increases. So we've got major changes occurring which are going to affect how we look at flooding. This is my favourite quote from one of our Scottish naturalists, John Muir, hardly known in Scotland at all, one of the best exports we ever did to America. He founded the American National Park systems. You go to Yosemite and places like this. This is John Muir. He left Dunbar in northeast Scotland, eastern Scotland when he was about 11, 13. We've rediscovered him. There's now a John Muir Trust, a John Muir Trail. But he makes this key point. When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe. And again, that's the way to think about natural flood management. It's all about recognizing complexity and lots of people involved with lots of different disciplines, interests, farmers, scientists, social scientists, people interested in geography, time, all these things working together. And of course that means there's a lot of uncertainty in all of this. There's lots of scientific uncertainty about the impacts of climate change. Does natural flood management work? There's lots of politics in all of this. You know, we've just talked about the EU, World Trade Organizations, CAP and things like this. So there's spatial, temporal, environmental, economical, social, cultural, everything in there. This is upper Speyside in Scotland. Highly changed landscape that's the effect of history. It's got artificial non-native trees, it's got flooding, it's got all sorts of aspects here about access, it's been depopulated by the highland clearances. All of that history wrapped into flooding and what happens as the water comes off here, flows through here, loads of sheep, loads of deer. You can't just look at it and go, right, this is a hydrological problem. It's all of these things added together. So what we've done in Scotland, we've got this emerging idea as NFM is part of a much wider vision. And we've essentially gone to what is a sort of sustainable plan-led approach delivered at a whole catchment scale. And the idea is you look, if you imagine this is Cork at the bottom here, you look at the whole of the catchment and you look at what you could restore at the top of this, the floodplains, the wetlands, the forests. I mean, 100 years ago, Britain had only 5% forest cover. So we take 95% out. Forests are hugely important, as you'll see in a minute, in slowing down flow and using up water. If you go across to Europe, the average now is about 37%. If you go to Scandinavia, it's about 74%. Scotland's average now is somewhere around 15% of this is tree cover. So we really have had a big impact. So we could look at restoring that. Then you could look at the channels, the way in which the pathways come, and we could look at the functions and the natural features and the processes. Do the waters just zoom down concrete or straight pathways, or do they meander gently? Can they flood on the floodplain? And then we need to introduce engineering and flood protection at the bottom. As I said, this is not either or. So we need to manage, think about the top, manage the sources, improve public investment to protect people and property. You've got to do it in partnership because all those different people, spatially, temporally, historically, all involved in this. And you could look at this as part of the potential for climate change adaptation. So we're very lucky. In 2009, we had a completely new bits of legislation, which I was then working for the Scottish Environmental Protection Agency as the Director of Science. So I took this one through Parliament. I have all the scars of all the parliamentary committees. I can tell you, fascinatingly, one of the key important influences was the NGOs. The NGOs were able to coalesce around what they wanted out of this flood bill and really lobby, some of the most effective, powerful lobbying by Environment Link, RSPB and others, about we want sustainable catchment management. We want natural flood management in this act. And it was a wonderful piece of negotiation. So we had a really good opportunity to rethink. We had a parliamentary inquiry. I spent 2 hours sitting in front of 12 parliamentarians, really enjoying a very grown-up debate. No one was arguing SNP, Labour, Lib Dems or anything else like that. This was a really interesting debate. It's non-political, for flip's sake. It's one of the few things that actually gets us together. And we got this ethos that we really ought to go to this idea of a catchment-based approach, etc. So we have an Act of Parliament, and it talks about the potential for flood management to be used, NFM, in an integral way. And just to tell you how important that is, if you look into the Act, SEPA, which is our Environmental Protection Agency, has to identify where NFM could contribute, written into the Act. Must consider when setting objectives what you could do with these things. Local authorities must include in their plans descriptions of how they're going to do it. In Scotland, unlike in England and Wales, the flood authority is the local authority. It is not the Environment Agency. That is a huge advantage because it forces two things to happen. They have to cooperate in partnership with the other local authorities, and they have to cooperate with the Environment Agency because it is the strategic body. And it means that the local authority recognise that actually this links to their biodiversity action plan. It links to their planning authority roles. It links to, where deprived communities live. It links to all sorts of other things that environment agencies don't necessarily have on their agenda. So we're actually really lucky. So Scottish Borders Council, one of the most influential and interesting groups, really good thinking about how we do all this. So SEPA have produced opportunity maps, and this is just the map from 2013 for runoff reduction. So at this scale, it looks at runoff reduction, floodplain storage, sediment management, and then it also looks at coasts. I'm not going to say anything really about coasts, despite the fact being christened sea spray and nominative determinism requiring me to be working in water. I'm staying inland, but clearly there are lots of issues around coastal defence, soft defences, mangroves, not that climate change has quite reached Cork yet with the mangrove forest that I've seen, but there we are. This is what is written into our Act, and I'd say it is really powerful. And that then threw up a series of challenges, 4 in particular, and I'll pick out and talk a little bit about these. If the Act requires that the natural characteristic of a catchment must be assessed before you build your wall, it actually then challenges the science, because the Act is way ahead of the science. Most Acts of Parliament are way behind the science. This one is well ahead, because it says, how do you integrate that with building flood walls? How do you mix the two together? How do you combine the cost benefits of doing natural flood management, which could have benefits for biodiversity, for recreation, for access, for fisheries, for water quality, for carbon sequestration, with other benefits? So how do you get that in? What's the effectiveness of all these things? I know what a wall will do. Really much more difficult to say what a meander will do, or a forest, or how long the forest is going to take to grow, or who's going to maintain it for the next 60 years. Really difficult. How do you work with land managers and influence them? Are we going to tell them, require them, or are we going to work with them? Because what we want is land managers, farmers who still have sustainable businesses. Absolutely vital that that's key to it. So the Eddleston Water, which is where I spend an awful lot of my life and where Mary and I will meet again next week in various points. I've never met her before. I'm going to see her 3 times next week in Scotland. Is the Scottish Government's long-term partnership project to try and actually start answering some of these questions. And it came out of the Act of Parliament, interestingly enough, it's that way around. Right, so just to identify where you are, actually you're down here, by the way, in case you haven't realised. Here's Scotland, this is Edinburgh about there, and we're talking about just in here. It's the Tweed. The Tweed, 16% in England, most of it in Scotland, and the Eddleston is up here. And it's had 3 aims right from the start. One is to look at the effectiveness of these measures. Do they work? Which ones work? One is to assess what do they do for habitats and species? So effectiveness on communities, floods. One is habitats and species. And the third aim is you've got to do this working with the landowners. There's no piles of money to buy landowners out. This is about cooperating with them to see what benefits they can get. And it's mainly, unusually, an empirical study, i.e. we have put masses of bits of kit in there. We're measuring what's happening. We've been doing it for 8 years. Only now are we trying to model it. Nearly everybody else starts with a model. We persuaded the Scottish Government that actually we quite like facts. It's a sort of novel idea that facts might be useful. Also, really, really interestingly, we had a scoping study at the beginning. If you're going to do this, please start with a scoping study. It's so important to find out what other people want and how they see success. As a scientist, I might see success as being X, Y, and Z. As a farmer, it's going to be totally different, their idea of success. And it's no good if we deliver my success and not the farmer's success or the politician's success. You've got to actually get the idea. What does success look like? So we had a scoping study. We then had a baseline monitoring and planning for 2 years. That's unusual. It wasn't meant to be 2 years. It just rained so hard the second year we couldn't get any kit on to actually do any work. So we got a dry year and a wet year. Wonderful going forward. We got some monitoring, and then bless the EU, I'm allowed to say that, they actually came up with some more monitoring. I'd like to point out right now that Scotland had 32 local authorities, and of those 32 voted to stay in the EU. At this point, I become very Scottish. But it's a huge partnership, and there are loads more, but essentially it's everybody who's anybody in that part of the world got involved in it. And Tweed Forum manage it, this NGO. So Eddleston is a very typical catchment. It's about 70 square kilometres. That's north, that's south. Edinburgh's roughly there on the top of the trellis. Peebles is here, and Berwick's somewhere over there. And it's straight. You'll notice that's not a typical Scottish river. You will give me with that. But it is a typical system, and as a scientist, we love it because it's very simple. It's straight and it's got some side bits. And it's also nice because it's got what I talked about. It's got some sources of the rain. Well, the rain ultimately comes down from above, of course, but or in Scotland, quite often sideways. You've got sources, and they might be covered in trees. They may not be. You've got pathways. This is a pretty straight pathway, you will admit. That's been dredged and kept there. And it's got what we call receptor, and people in Peebles call March Street. And it's where the flooding hits down in Peebles at the bottom. And it's got a series of management challenges. I'm required by my organisers here to put in a photograph of an otter. It is a special area of conservation for otters. I have seen otters. I have got that close to otters on the Tweed. And it's got a long history of management and flooding, way back for centuries. So this ain't new. 1723 they were talking about flooding. for flip's sake. It's actually designated the EU for its ranunculus, but it's also got otters, it's got lampreys, and it was classified in bad ecological status. That's the worst you can get in the Water Framework Directive. And another little tip for you, if you're starting a project, start with one that's disastrous, because that way you get the nice incremental recovery as you go on. Always good if you're explaining it to politicians. So you've got that rather nice scenario. And we started at the beginning by just assessing what we've got there. What's the land use? What's the risk of flooding? We just used local data, etc., to do all that. And there are current floodings. This is one of my colleagues, Andrew Black, who's a hydrologist, trying to measure the flood flow. This is 2012. That bridge had been there for 100 years. This is one of these really intense local rainfall events. So it took out a bridge which had been there for 100 years at the top of the catchment. At the bottom of the catchment, you couldn't actually recognise there'd been a flood. And we're only talking 18 kilometres between those two events. So, and you'll notice it was in June. It wasn't a winter flood. So that's one of the challenges we faced. So ultimately, what we were trying to do is to link this idea with policy with practice. You know, could we reduce the risk of flooding? Does it work? Can we improve the habitats? What works? What are the other benefits? What are the costs? And how we do it whilst keeping farmers working. And one of the things you have to start off with is saying, what am I going to restore the habitat to? Natural flood management to what end? As I said earlier on, one of the earliest river restorations was in Darlington. And we found a 5,000-year-old elk bone from the days of the primordial forest in Darlington. And as I said, there are various people who would think that would be a wonderful, successful restoration of Darlington to that sort of idea. But that's not where you have to go. But you do need to know what was there. So if you go to the Scottish Museum and dig around, you'll find a map of 1790, which is our river, with all the old meanders in it. And we then discovered, why was the river straightened? And we had it wrong. We said it was straightened to build a railway line, 1850. Nah. We then said it was straightened to produce land drainage for farming. Nah. It was straightened in about 1800 to build a road between Peebles and Edinburgh. That is the planning engineer's map, if you like it, for 1890, for what that road is. And if you take it out of the pub and back, which is where we had a look at it, and into the light, you'll discover there's a pencil line all the way through the middle, which says, line of new cut for river. So we know that in this bit, it took 16% of the river's length out. And anyone who knows going up or down a hairpin bend knows if you go round like that, you have a very shallow slope. If you go straight down, it's very fast. So we've increased the speed because we've shortened the river dramatically. We also know it's sinuous right back in 1750. These are the Roy maps. These are the famous ones that the English built to try and quell the Jacobites and the rebellions. It's the best maps going. It's actually about how do you march a load of armies from A to B as fast as you can while avoiding the Scots. But these tree lines are still here. We can still see exactly where they are. That tree line, I'll come back to that. It's quite important. We know where they are. So we know why it was straightened, we know when it was straightened, and that is really useful if you're talking about what to do. So we started with this scoping study, and here you've got this nice straight river, which told you what was there, and then it came out with a whole load of recommendations about what we could do. Hadn't talked to any farmers at this point, what it would cost, stakeholder engagement, who we need to talk to, and if we were going to do it, what were we going to monitor? This idea of success. Start with defining what you're going to monitor and what success looks like. And then we came up with this wonderful map, which was, here's the catchment, here's all the things we could do in sourceways, floodplains, paths, and the uplands. And as I said, the main flooding bit's going to happen down here in Peebles and in the village just there. So that's all the ideas of what you could do. Then you have the most important step of all, and that is you need someone to go and talk to the local communities and the farmers. And that someone ain't going to be an academic, certainly not going to be someone from the Environment Agency or the Council or the Scottish Natural Heritage or all these regulatory bodies that farmers hate for all very good, just have problems with. So you take this target list that's come from researchers and local stakeholders and desires, and you need a trusted intermediary. And this is where Tweed Forum, which is, think of Rivers Trust, been working since the 1990s, comes in being. They do all the talking to the landowners. Despite the fact I was the first ever chairman of this organisation, I've worked with them for 25 years, I don't talk to the landowners. I do eventually, because I know more. But they do all the talking, because they're not worried about the timescale of the Water Framework Directive. What's the particular interest in water quality? They're actually just interested in, they understand farming. All of them come from a farming background. They understand what's possible, what isn't possible. And the amount of cups of tea, glasses of whiskey that they have to consume in this process can't be measured. But it's absolutely important. We have all sorts of plans that have never got going, simply because they're great plans from a scientific or a policy point of view, but they don't work on the ground with the farmers. Fair enough. But in 2 generations' time, and most of our farmers make most of you look very young, with my bad eyesight, things change. People change. Farms get sold. And farming is not profitable at all. You know, we're on the edge. We're not talking about this. So they act as the go-between, and that's really critical, because you need to understand, if you're working with farmers, if what you're suggesting for NFM is a completely idiotic suggestion to a farmer trying to run a business, so will you get the response on the left or the response on the right? And we've done some work again with farmers across the whole of the Tweed catchment, as lots of other people have, to try and work out what is it that if you suggest to them, they're going to go, you are forgetting it. So this just says, how likely are you to consider a number of things? And if you suggest to a farmer that you'd quite like to block the tile drains, that end says, not on your life, basically. And this end says, not even got an answer. And 5 is, yes, I'm going to think of doing it. So you know that's not going to work. Reducing stock density, again, not particularly into. But if you start getting into trees along watercourses and large areas of trees, you start getting some farmers who are going to go, yep, go with that. And if you're looking at otters and rivers, that's where you want to go. And we've done a lot of work on how do you overcome the barriers to people wanting to get involved in natural flood management, and what you can do, what tactics. As I said, you know, the use of a trusted intermediary is key, that they understand farming, they're personable, that you target local ambassadors. Farmers actually will look at what their neighbours have done. And if your neighbours have done something, then they'll go, oh, I wonder what happened there, how much did it cost, what did you get out of it, as we all do. You've got to talk money, and you've got to cut through the paperwork. And then you manage the delivery. Don't ask them to do it. So actually, the paperwork is huge. If you're an agency, a funding body, a local authority, you've got to have paperwork, legal arrangements. We're shifting boundaries of rivers, for flipping sake, where this owner now suddenly finds that the boundaries shifted. Now that's a huge legal agreement. But if you're an NGO and you go in and you're trusted and you've been working them, it's amazing how many things happen that don't have a legal statement to it. Proof of work, property, you can't do that if you're an agency. Serious amounts of money. Some farmers are so anti-paperwork that they will do it all themselves at their own expenses. These are just 2 examples, we've got loads more, just to get out of the paperwork. You know, and do you blame them? NGOs can risk operating without it, but I'm a trustee of this one, and it is a risk. And we actually called a meeting last week, I won't tell you which river it was, but it's not actually in the Tweed, about work where we're doing, because we're very worried about our exposure. Because if you go down this end, we quite often loan, inverted commas, money up front to farmers, because we know they'll get it back. And again, you can't do that if you're an agency. You're getting into all sorts of rules here. So repair and maintenance, things like this, because we want the farmers to be in business and to be maintaining. That's the old river, by the way. We want the farmers to be maintaining all of this as we go forward. So what we did in Edelston basically was just stick kit in there. We measured everything. River flows, groundwaters, rainfall, habitats. If it moved, we measured it. If it was wet, we measured it. Landowners, communities, ecosystem services, and basically, you know, it rains, we measure it. It's got salmon, more otters. And what we're interested in is, can we change the flood flow? So it rains here, river goes up, comes back down again, floods at that peak. Can we actually change it so it does more like this? You know, can we actually influence things? That's really what we're interested in do. So we have more bits of kit in this. Remember, that's about 18 kilometres, 16 kilometres. Every one of these is a detailed gauge which tells you what's happening. When it rains, we can trap a rainfall coming down the system. So that river bridge was collapsed there. didn't influence the flood there. So things happen very locally. So we're trying to actually do all this. I'm very happy in taking photographs, very happy to leave this photo, this whole talk for you to have a look at. And as I say, I'm around all day, so please feel free. And this is what we've done so far. We've done 116 high flow log structures. That's like sort of fast forwarding a beaver and getting it to fell a tree just where you want to. You know. There aren't, as far as I know, any beavers on the Tweed. There are beavers across a lot of the rest of Scotland now. We've planted something like 330,000 native trees on 207 hectares. We've created 28 ponds. So that's the sort of things upstream. And then we've done some contour planting. We've created one big floodplain pond, and we've remeandered about 3 kilometres of river. And if you're interested in water framework directive measurements, yes, we've taken it from bad up to about moderate. They're just reassessing everything. And we know how to get to good, actually. We can work out exactly how to get to good. Whether it's worth the money, I doubt, but anyhow, you could do it. Just to show you what it looks like, that's what happens if you plant. You just put in hundreds and hundreds of these. And what you're trying to do is to stop this runoff like that, but to keep it going. A lot of work with that. Log jams. Then we have all these other ones, which are flow restrictors, debris dams. This is the beaver approach, if you like, felling things across there. Get down into the natural flood area. We do model things, I ought to point out. We don't just go outside there and say, let's fell a tree here, let's dig a ditch there, etc. For a starter, the whole of Edinburgh's water supply comes down this valley in a pipeline. So if we dug our meander in the wrong place, most of Edinburgh would suddenly find it had no water, or it had some interesting water. But I'm not allowed to tell you where it is, apparently. So we've looked at all sorts of remeandering, modelling ideas from that point of view. And we've got in there and started doing it. So as I said, here is the old line of the river. You would never logically do a bit of river restoration like this, by the way. You would start at one end and work your way up. But you're working with farmers at different times who have different priorities. So we actually started with that one. Then when I was doing a survey for otters, by the way, walking up here, I found otter spraints here, and I got up to here, and this was just completely underwater. So I talked to Tweed Forum. We walked up to the farm here. I sat and drank a cup of tea while Hugh discussed with the farmer. And by the time we walked back out again, I was told we had permission to fell the trees that were here and remeander all the way back through this, which is all what this is. We then did a bit right up there. We then did a bit 6 kilometres there. We then, by then, managed to persuade this farmer that we could link this bit to this bit. No logical person would ever do NFM in that order. But that's reality. That's working with farmers to their priorities, to their... And the end result is really good. The other thing to notice on this is that is a very important silage field for this farmer. Take that out of production and his farm business collapses. It's only a small percentage of his farm, but it's absolutely vital. 2 silage crops plus all his after grazing is on there. So there is a flood bank in there and the river goes round it. So you are working, as I said, you can't just put the thing back. You have to work with local farmers to get what you can in all of this. Whoops, that just says we have all sorts of other things that go with it. And we created lots of ponds up in the areas. Some of them rather quite fun ones, some of them quite huge. And if you're really into groundwater, which is the bit we all forget, the British Geological Survey are on here as well, and they've got a fantastic model showing what happens to the water coming in and out of rivers. Because actually what you see is what's on the surface. What may be equally important is what's under the surface and what's going in and out of it. And then we did lots of biodiversity sampling, really on aquatic invertebrates, plants and fish. And we used standard methodologies. Those of you who have ever done a kick sample know what this is. This is just standard SEPA, a biologist doing kick sample. This is Forth Rivers Trust. The fisheries folk doing fish sampling, electrofishing. It's mainly salmon and hundreds, if not thousands, of lampreys and trout. So we've done all those, and you start getting into some big numbers, 45,000 little individuals that big in one sampling year to have a look at of 90 species. And you can imagine staring down a microscope, gradually going blind looking at all of that. But we also looked at habitat monitoring, because you can't spend your time doing that. It's huge amounts of money and effort, but you can probably do a bit more, because what you're going to do quite often is take a digger in there and you're going to shift the habitat around. So we did an awful lot. Again, it's high tech here. Take one metal bucket, take the bottom off, plunge it in, use all the students you can get hold of. They're expendable. And measure the size and weight of all the gravel and rocks and everything else that you're taking out to understand what's happening. Okay, so some results. These are really initial, because remember I said we are basically sitting there having put all this kit in. Now we want a good flood. There's no one here living in Peebles, is there? Good, I can't say that in Peebles. But actually, we would like a big flood to test, inverted commas, everything we've done. The floods that have occurred are really quite good, because we have the main public road going up alongside there between Edinburgh, and Peebles flooded about 2 years ago. And what was interesting was the local press ran a lovely thing saying this part of Peebles didn't flood because of all the works being done on this catchment. Now, I perhaps should have gone on to the local press and said, actually the reason is, if you look at the distribution of rainfall, that side of Peebles got a 1 in 50 year expansion, we got a 1 in 4. But hey, occasionally the life works with you, and arguing, it's not on. And quite clearly, everyone saw that the flooding that occurred in the river valley of the Edelston did go across the valley and didn't go elsewhere. So absolutely, they were right. A lot of water got held up in the Edelston. It's just that the main road now, as you saw, because it built in 1798, goes alongside it. So what do we know? If you model, because we have done models, planting a lot of trees to the extent that agriculture really stops in the valley, you can get a really nice 20% reduction. Indeed, you can even get 40% reduction in peak flood flows. This, though, is really interesting. If you look at what happens to the rainfall on forests, and you look at some of these old forests, remember I had the 1750 map, Roy with his, those forests, some of them are still there. So the BGS guys went and looked underneath it, and if you compare what happens there to there, about 5 to 8 times more water hits this and then goes into the groundwater and does not run off. So that's really good empirical evidence that if you plant trees that are 200 years old, which is slightly difficult straight off, but there is a huge difference in what happens to the water. You've obviously got evapotranspiration, you've got a lot of water being used by the trees, but you've also got this run into here. So trees are really good. If you look at what happens with these engineered log jams or whatever it is, you can look at what happens in the streams with them and what happens in the streams without them. Because remember, we've got bits of kit everywhere measuring what happens to water levels, and we've got lots of students, again, they're useful students, doing lots of cross sections as you come along here. And if you look at what happens there, we found absolutely that by putting those in, you get a delay in about half an hour to an hour of a flood coming down. Okay. That's important because you've got a delay, you've got time to get out of the way. You can also do models on those and show that we've got reductions in peak water level and delays in time doing it. And you can also see how many leaky dams will actually work. You can do the same with our ponds. Ponds are really good. Unfortunately, they fill up very quickly. And there's a tension between the biodiversity people who'd like a pond full of water and the flood people who'd like a pond without any water. As they say, it's not a pond. Downstream, you can model, and the big ponds do look to be really, really good, but they take a lot of area. But we also looked at what happens to the biodiversity when you start doing this. This is our self-same river when it was built, and what happens when it floods. Here's our river going up there. And what you got there, and I'll just nip through these, is here's what it looks like, if you like. This is the first year it was done. If you want to get a lot of publicity, invite the minister down. Give the minister the opportunity to be the first person in 200 years to break open a new meander. He was very good at it, actually. The local press will turn up, actually the national press will turn up, and he won't stop talking about it in Parliament for a week. He was very good. He was going, boys with toys. So here's your river, just afterwards, and you can see running around, these are guys from the Environment Agency down there. You've got a river changing rapidly as you go along. What does that do in terms of habitats? What's the science behind it? All you need to know, there's some blue and some red. The blue ones are much bigger there. The red ones are much bigger there. 2009, we had one sort of habitat in the river. It was a glide, very boring. 2016, we got shoots and riffles and runs and glides and pools. Habitat diversity massively increased. Really important, because a lot of this is spawning habitats for salmon. Salmon fishing in the Tweed, worth about £24 million, 512 jobs. At its lowest ever at the moment. Anything you can do to help salmon is going to be politically, economically, socially, environmentally really up there. We know we've got big change in habitats. I'll speed through this. All you need to know there is that one of these graph bits is up there, the others are all down there. What that tells you is that we've got a lot of active bar features, and these are key features in terms of habitats for little invertebrates and things like that, and for growing ranunculus. And again, all you need to know from this one is there's some black blobs here and there's some white ones here. And the white ones are all on this side, and they were before we did anything, the black blobs on this side, and they look much higher. And what that tells us is that there's a significant relationship between the invertebrate species and the type of habitat we've created. What I haven't shown you also is that the fish guys are getting some really interesting evidence that the fish are bigger in the remeandered sections. And the other thing, just getting to the end of this, we ought to talk a little bit about money. We're just now doing two things in the last year of our European funding. One is to look at the whole money thing, and the other is to model how many ponds do we need to stop the flooding of people's downstream, because people does flood. But we've done one piece of published research on a cost-benefit analysis of if you planted a lot of trees, could you make it stack up under the proper rules, we're not inventing our own, of cost-benefit analysis for projects going forward? And you talk about net present value going over a 20, 30, 40-year period. If you look at tree planting as a sole NFM measure, it just about breaks even under a climate change scenario going forward. If, on the other hand, you realise that NFM delivers all these other things, whereas a concrete wall doesn't, then it is hugely cost beneficial to it. And what's interesting is that the climate regulation side, the carbon sequestration, the water quality, the recreation, the aesthetics, all of these things add up beautifully. So coming back to my beginning, don't think NFM as being a solution to flooding. Think of NFM as being a partial solution to sustainable flood risk management that's going to deliver lots of other things as well. So it shows the importance of trying to identify, the value of trying to stop all the slurry from this going in there. The value of that's obvious, the huge value of fishing and things like this, that salmon production we're producing. So just to send, what does this implication mean for all of this? Well, we know from what we've got so far that these measures can reduce flood risk, and the whole challenge now is to scale it up. We know that it's only going to happen if you have a lot of these things happening at once in the catchment. We know that if you model it, you've got some quite interesting flows, and my immediate job when I get back on Tuesday, the day before I go and talk to Mary for 3 days, is actually to talk with the modelers about the next phase of the modelling, etc. We know that these NFF measures also enhance habitat biodiversity, and that therefore gives you better invertebrates, better salmon, trout and everything else, and there's a lot of other benefits coming on the back of it. So how are you going to use NFM? And this is my last slide really. You need to think of it in 3 ways. Firstly, it's a contribution to sustainable flood risk management. Just don't talk about NFM versus big dams and walls. It's part of it. It's upstream, it's pathways. And you can effectively model that with the current knowledge, and I suspect Mary will tell you a bit more about that in terms of what you've got. You can really think of it as an important contribution to climate change adaptation. And Scottish Borders Council, and there's a little group of us who work with them strategically looking at all their big schemes, £40 million scheme for the saving Selkirk that's just been produced. There's another one for Hoyk, for Galashiels. We can do all of this as no regrets actions, which is going to improve as a climate change adaptation, all the ones we've got. They're very difficult to model, very difficult. This is almost a belief in the eye of the beholder, because I can't tell you how long a tree of 60 acres, a tree plantation of 60 hectares will grow to maturity to reduce the roughness to, it's getting a bit dicey. But SEPA modelling guidance requires basic 20% uplift to account for climate change. That's now looking more like 40%. But the other thing is you can look at the contribution to multiple benefits, improved biodiversity and ecology and all these other aspects. But you have to realise that quite often you're trading off with agriculture. If you're not producing wheat or barley or potatoes or whatever else, and you're producing something else, you're going to have to buy that wheat, barley, potatoes from someone else. And you have to be slightly careful that what you're not now doing is knackering a rather nice, pristine piece of Kenyan forest or something like that, to fly in your sugar snap peas. But these are all no regret adaptation measures. That's the other key message. We can do them now. And with that, I will shut up and say thank you to a whole load of people. that project, if you want to see what's happening on the Edelston, it's all there. We have a database. If you can't find it, give me an email. And that's all about working with farmers. Thank you. How's that?